So let's get into part 2, which is benchmarking and labeling at the local level. So we've had this statewide picture of what is required by law, and then digging down a little deeper with Ben's presentation as to why we would really care about benchmarking and things we can learn about it. And as both mentioned, there are several cities throughout the state of California who have passed more stringent local benchmarking requirements. So they're here, 3 of those cities are here to tell you about what their requirements are and why they chose to do that. Starting out, we will have a panel of 3 local government representatives explaining their above and beyond requirements. Adrienne Etherton from the city of Brisbane, Ammon Reagan from the city of Berkeley, and Barry Hooper from City and County of San Francisco. So Adrienne, you're up first.
Great, thanks Emily. Let me go ahead and just get my slides pulled up here. Hopefully everybody is seeing those.
Looks good.
Great. So again, my name is Adrienne. I'm the Sustainability Manager for the City of Brisbane, and I'm going to tell you all about our Brisbane Building Efficiency Program. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background to start, our City Climate Action Plan was adopted in September 2015, and that plan included a measure to address in some way existing building emissions. And so when I started with the city in late 2017, I looked at that climate action plan, and that was a high priority measure for our city, and also looked at our most recent inventory available at the time, which is this one here in 2015. And you can see that our commercial sector, including industrial and direct access, is 30% of our total emissions profile, second only to transportation, whereas our residential sector represents just 8%. So it was very clear from the get-go that to address emissions in existing buildings, our focus really needed to be on the commercial side. In 2018, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District had a climate protection grant opportunity, which we applied for and were awarded, which is supporting all of this work. So much thanks to the folks at the Air District. And that enabled us to hire consulting firm, the Energy Coalition, to help us to work through the work that we're doing now. So the goals of our program, really first and foremost, is to reduce the environmental impact of our local built environment, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions from these buildings, especially through energy efficiency, as well as water efficiency. There's also a lot of secondary goals or co-benefits of these types of programs. So we know that improvements in energy and water efficiency can improve the comfort, safety, and health for building occupants. It can improve a building's resilience and value. That's both on the kind of capital asset as well as for the occupants in reduced energy bills. We also see an opportunity to inform decision makers about energy and water performance and improvement opportunities. So that's decision makers at the building level as well as at the local level, really better understanding what's happening in our buildings in town and where we might be able to add additional programs in the future to help support improvement opportunities. There's also opportunities to support clean energy and decarbonization because we have incorporated those into some of our compliance options. The data transparency can help support market transformation as owners and lessees have more information about the expected energy use as they're making decisions about where to locate or invest. And then green job creation as we see increasing need for building auditors, energy services companies, and the like. So to start off our program, we really needed to look at our local market in Brisbane. And so we started by looking at what type of buildings we have. And you can see here in blue that industrial buildings represent a huge part of our local building stock. So we knew we were going to need to include them, which is actually typically not the case in the state or other local ordinances. So that was going to set us apart a little bit. The next thing we looked at was the average building size. And you can see here we have on the top, industrial buildings average a little over 14,000 square foot and commercial a little over 12. So definitely much less than that 50,000 square foot threshold at the state level. So we knew we were going to have a pretty low threshold. We also looked at who the top building owners were in town and really targeted these folks with outreach as we were developing the ordinance last year. We included one-on-one meetings with a handful of these folks who represented almost a third of our estimated square footage covered. So looking to, kind of where to set that benchmarking cutoff, the goal was really to maximize the covered square footage while minimizing the number of buildings affected. And so we ended up settling on a 10,000 square foot threshold, which gets us 69% of the square footage in town, but, kind of tries, before we start jumping up here, to higher percentages of the building owners. In case you're wondering, the max here is 72% because this graph does not include single family properties. And then similarly, when we were looking to our beyond benchmarking requirements, how those performance requirements were going to come through, we really wanted to continue that idea of maximizing the covered square footage, but minimizing the number of owners impacted. So we set different thresholds for 40,000 square foot plus buildings to do an ASHRAE level 2 audit. That's a fairly standard audit requirement, but it can be costly. And so we are covering 79% of our total square foot at over 40,000 square foot plus, but only 44% of the buildings by number. So as we were going through developing the ordinance, we really looked at other ordinances that already existed before us, most closely aligned with Los Angeles and San Jose, which were some of the most recent ordinances in the state at the time. But we knew we were going to need to adjust to fit this local market. So as I mentioned, we include industrial buildings, which most others don't. But one of the things we realized in kind of making that decision was that the provisions of the state law that require utilities to give aggregated data to building owners if they have 3 or more tenants was going to leave a big gap for a lot of our industrial buildings, a lot of warehouses. We have a single tenant. So, we knew that there was going to be a concern there with data access. So we looked around a little bit and we found that Washington, D.C. had an example where their local ordinance actually extends some of the requirements to tenants. And we decided to incorporate some of those requirements to help ease those concerns of the owners with those rental agreements that provide all that control to the lessees. So some of the ways this comes through is that we actually have the ability, if there's a single tenant, for the tenant and owner to agree that the tenant can take responsibility for compliance. If they do not want to do that, the tenants are required to provide their data to the owners. And if they are not willing to do that, they can be covered by the non-compliance penalties. Again, as others have mentioned, we're not really trying to come down hard on compliance, especially early on, but we did want to have that option available to us. We also provide the tenants and owners both the options of exemptions, extensions, hardships, and appeals so that both parties have that possibility. And one of the things that we really hope is going to be an outcome of this tenant-owner relationship is to come to a green lease agreement. And so those green lease provisions can help to more equitably share both the costs and benefits of improvement upgrades. And so we're really hoping that by including this as a compliance option, we can encourage more owners and tenants to seek these agreements and make further compliance easier down the road. And then lastly, we wanted to ask folks to report on their current or planned distributed energy resources, just to really help us further understand where we might expect improvements in the future and where we might be able to support some of those through other local programs. So, through all of this, we really wanted to provide a lot of different options for people depending on their situation. So kind of makes for a slightly complicated compliance flow chart here. So I'll just kind of walk you through it. We start with the annual benchmarking, which will start next spring, May 15th, 2021, for any 10,000 square feet or more commercial, industrial, or multifamily buildings. And then a couple of years down the road, starting in 2023 for commercial or 2024 for industrial and residential, we'll start our beyond benchmarking, and that will be in 5-year cycles. So there are 2 paths. We have the performance path or the prescriptive path. On the performance path, this will be new buildings less than 5 years old will automatically be included in this performance path. Basically, we know they're built to latest code, so they should be fairly efficient. They'll kind of get a pass for that first cycle and come in the next one. And then other buildings can show us that they are either that they are energy and water efficient. And there's a number of ways they can do that. If they get an Energy Star score, taking a step back, kind of going back to one of the other questions, we do use Energy Star Portfolio Manager as the compliance tool. So if they have an Energy Star score of 80 or more, or they've improved it by 20 or more points, that would be showing high performance. Some buildings don't get Energy Star scores, so they would have the opportunity to look at their site greenhouse gas intensity being better than the property type mean, or having reduced that by 20%. If they are LEED existing buildings operations and maintenance certified, they would be eligible. And then in the last bucket, we have distributed energy resources. So if they have solar already or other DERs, and we are lumping decarbonization or decarbonized buildings into that bucket. On the water efficiency side, it's primarily the Energy Star water score of 80 or more, or water use intensity that has been reduced by 20%. So if your building doesn't fall into any of those categories, then you're going to jump down to the prescriptive path. And this is where we're going to ask you to start with an audit. So that's where that distinction between the larger and smaller buildings comes in. Those larger buildings will do the ASHRAE Level 2 audit, both energy and water fields. And then the smaller buildings will use the Asset Score Full DOE tool, again, both energy and water. And that audit report will be due by May 15th in those 2023 or 2024 cycles, depending on your building type. And that will set a kind of cycle to take action in the next 5 years, where you'll have options to either retro commission your building, to attest to a green lease, or to take one energy and one water measure from a list of measures that will be continuing to update over time to incorporate the latest and greatest. And it's probably not readily apparent from this, but it is possible that a building could be energy efficient and be on the performance path, but need to make some improvements in the water area and do that water audit and water measure, or vice versa. So one of the questions that we got a lot as we were developing the ordinance last year was what the costs and savings of audits and retro commissioning were. So it's kind of hard to come up with these numbers because it varies a lot by your building and also by the auditor, but we estimated about $600 to $2,000 for those asset scores, so relatively modest costs for those smaller buildings. And then for audits, they can range about 10 to 15 cents per square foot, retro commissioning 20 to 30 cents per square foot. And if you look at the savings, really estimated savings tend to be in the 20% plus range. 20 to 40% by energy efficiency measures is pretty common. And so that, savings might be somewhere on the par of what those costs would be for, in the first year, and those savings would continue. So as far as the expected impacts for Brisbane, we estimated at the time about 109 buildings would be affected by our ordinance. As we're working to implement this year, it looks like we might have a few more than that, but probably somewhere in the 120 to 130 range. Again, the vast majority of that square footage will later be subject to those ASHRAE Level 2 audits, but a majority of the buildings will do that asset score full. And then as far as emissions impacts, we estimated about 2,700 metric tons of carbon equivalent reduction within 5 years of the ordinance effective date. I should have mentioned probably this was passed in December 2019. so just about 6 months ago. And to put those emissions impacts in context, that represents about a 14% or so reduction from the commercial sector, or about 4% overall reduction. And further context, in our 2015 Climate Action Plan, by far the most impactful expected measure was adopting a community choice energy program, and that was estimated at about 1,400 metric tons CO2e. So we are expecting some fairly significant reductions from this locally. So just kind of wrapping up, where are we now? We're working on implementation, have a lot of things that we're working on this year in our phase 2 of the grant before we have folks start complying next year. We wanted to show some leadership by benchmarking our city buildings first. So we are basically complete with that, as we are working through developing administrative systems with our consultants, the Energy Coalition, and their technology sub-consultants, MOCA. We're also developing lots of resources to help folks comply, planning to have some outreach, education, and training, as well as run a voluntary compliance pilot later this year, and then figure out our ongoing post-grant resource needs and develop a toolkit for other jurisdictions that might want to replicate the program. So with that, I will go ahead and wrap it up here. Here's my contact information, and I will pass it back to Emily.